Well, good afternoon and welcome. I see it's 2 o'clock and I believe the first of our webinar participants have joined us. My name is Adrian Bertrand. I'm one of the Six Capitals ESG advisory team. It's a pleasure to have you join us this afternoon for this last Theme 4 webinar, which is looking at determining the impacts of climate risk. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to some good and active discussion during today's workshop. Just a few webinar administrative points. We encourage you to please ask your questions while our various presenters are presenting. Please use the Q&A chat function to either ask a question or to make a comment. That enables our various speakers to respond to your comments, both verbally during certain parts of their presentation, but also via the chat function. And I'm sure we'd all benefit from some of the communications on the chat function in terms of responding to various questions. Also, just a reminder that the webinar will be recorded, and we'll be making available the webinar recordings as well as the presenter slide decks available via this particular project resource website page, which is available on the DNA Economics website, dnaeconomics.com, and look for the SA Climate Disclosure section of the website. Should you have any technical difficulties during the website and you feel that it's not on your end but on our end, please would you get in touch with Safaku Matibe, and Safaku will do his best to get you back with us as soon as possible. In terms of our program agenda for the next 2 hours of this webinar, I'll be shortly introducing our guest presenters for today's webinar. I'll then be providing a project overview, and what we will then do is we'll be hearing from our WWF speakers, who will be speaking to us on identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks. And then we'll be handing over to Vivid Economics, who will be providing a very high-level introduction to climate scenarios and raising awareness around our forthcoming climate scenarios workshop for asset managers taking place on the 30th of September. We do have an opportunity for a formal Q&A session as part of today's webinar, but we do encourage you to ask your questions as early on as possible in the webinar. With that, let me introduce our guest presenters and speakers today. The first person that I'm delighted to introduce is Mr. Thapelo Tladi, and Thapelo will be providing the opening remarks on behalf of the British High Commission, and Thapelo also represents the UK PACT South Africa initiative. So Thapelo is a geoscientist and energy and sustainability professional. His interests and professional experience include climate change mitigation policy and economics, renewable energy development, and sustainable natural resource management. Thapelo has experience in these areas across the mining industry, management consulting, and international development. In his current role, Thapelo works for the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office at the British High Commission in Pretoria, where he is the head of UK PACT and international climate finance programs in the climate change and energy team. It's also a great pleasure to introduce Wendy Engel from WWF South Africa. Wendy is a finance sector specialist at the Finance Practice Unit of WWF South Africa and has a dual capacity role to drive objectives of finance practice strategy, which is focused on ESG adoption and green financial solutions within their WWF SA Business Development Unit to develop a sustainable funding model for WWF South Africa. Wendy's previously been employed at ABSA Group as an agricultural economist and was responsible for the due diligence process across agribusiness credit lending to deliver annual financial targets, compiling annual concentrate risk, market intelligence reports, and new product development. And we're certainly looking forward to Wendy's presentation today. Joining Wendy from WWF South Africa is Justin Smith. Justin Smith is the head of the Business Development Unit at WWF South Africa, which oversees business partnerships, marketing, and fundraising activities for the organization. Justin was previously employed at Woolworths and was leading the Good Business Journey, or the sustainability program for Woolworths, and was responsible for strategy, structure, and integration of the Good Business Journey to deliver on its over 200 targets, which included transformation, social development, environmental issues, and climate change across its African and Australasian businesses. Prior to this, Justin was an environmental lawyer and also worked within sustainability at Nedbank Group. And Justin is a very busy guy with a number of other commitments in his WWF role. Lastly, we're delighted that Rafael Chanskelsen is joining us for today's webinar. Rafael is a senior economist at Vivid Economics, working in Vivid Economics Sustainable Finance Practice Group. Rafael has advised multiple commercial banks and asset managers on all aspects of aligning their portfolios with the Paris Agreement, which include portfolio footprinting, target setting, and lending strategy for decarbonization. Rafael led the initial development of Vivid's Paris Alignment Toolkit, or PAT, and specializes in climate strategy for private debt and non-listed equity portfolios. He has also advised the TCFD on reporting for several international financial institutions, including one of the UK's largest high street banks. Rafael's previously been a competition economist at Fideris Partners, LLP, where he led the firm's expansion into South Africa. Here he worked on a series of high-profile cartel and benchmark manipulation cases, largely focused on the financial sector. Rafael is a Rhodes Scholar and holds 2 MSc degrees from the University of Oxford. If we were all in a physical room together, I'd ask you to give a round of applause for our speakers, but we won't do that. Instead, I'm going to ask Thapelo to provide us with his opening remarks and formal welcome on behalf of our funders. Thank you very much, Thapelo.
Thank you, Adrian. Hope I'm audible enough. Yes, thank you for that introduction, Adrian. Welcome to everyone. Warm welcome to everyone, rather, to this webinar. And thank you to DNA Economics, as well as our wider partners on the project, both on for setting up these webinars and these workshops, but also on delivering this very strategic and important project for us as the British High Commission, but also for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who fund UK PACT. So in terms of what UK PACT is, just thought I'd give you a bit of background to the program, as well as the work we do on it. So as Adrian mentioned, UK PACT is funding this project on climate-related financial disclosure. UK PACT stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions, and it's a global program worth around £60 million that is running across quite a number of emerging economies, and really working with these countries to help them achieve their national determined contribution commitments, and essentially to help them to become, so to speak, more Paris aligned. It's a program that mainly focuses on supporting climate change mitigation initiatives, but we kind of also support, especially in a context like South Africa, initiatives that have both mitigation and adaptation core benefits. Like I mentioned at the top, the program itself is funded by the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And PACT is actually part of a broader range of programs within the UK's what is known as its international climate finance portfolio. And essentially what the ICF is a large part of funding that represents the UK's contribution and support to developing countries in their climate change efforts, both mitigation and adaptation. One, I guess, important thing to note regarding UK PACT and its ethos really is that PACT is a demand-driven program. And what we mean by that is that the sort of interventions we support partner governments on are really aligned to their priorities and areas that they need support on. So we're not really prescriptive in what we, in the sort of support we give, but we try to be as demand-driven as possible to ensure that these are locally acceptable, they're relevant, as well as they make sense in the context in which we operate in. Next slide, Adrian. Thank you. So the way PACT is structured, the program is structured across 3 components. It's a technical assistance and capacity building program. I forgot to mention that at the top. And it's structured across 3 components, which are the components across which we provide technical assistance and capacity building support. The first one is what we call country programs. And this is really a project-based technical assistance facility where we provide grant funding to projects such as this one across a number of different themes. This component of UK PACT operates in a number of countries, as you see there, including South Africa, but as well as Mexico, China, Colombia, and Malaysia. There's also what we call a Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which is another kind of component of PACT. And here, similarly to the country programs, we support, we provide grant funding rather to technical assistance and capacity building projects that are more regional in nature. So they are addressing, I would say, regional issues with regard to climate change mitigation. And these are projects that would involve a multitude of countries. The last component that we provide support on is what we call Skillshares and Secondments. And this is really where we bring UK expertise from the public and private sector in the UK together with stakeholders in country. So like in South Africa, government stakeholders, for them to exchange knowledge and to have peer-to-peer learnings across a number of different themes, ranging from green finance to the just energy transition and so forth. In addition to Skillshares, which are, like I said, peer-to-peer knowledge exchanges, which last anything from 2 weeks to 6 months, we also provide longer-term secondments where we second experts into key government institutions for a longer period of time. Next slide. So in terms of South Africa's UK PACT program, because given what I said at the top, that PACT is a demand-driven program, and therefore looks quite differently in the various countries we operate in. In South Africa, our project portfolio really is structured across around 3 areas, or themes rather: energy, sustainable transport, and sustainable finance. And within energy, here we're really looking at energy efficiency and demand side management, renewable energy development and alternative fuel sources, as well as the just transition. Collectively across these 3 themes, we have about 10 projects we're supporting, and our project portfolio is worth just over £3 million. This particular project related to climate related financial disclosure falls within our sustainable finance project portfolio. And this is really an area where we're working with various stakeholders, including the National Treasury and other financial stakeholders on various issues, such as climate-related financial disclosure, but also green finance, taxonomy development, and so forth. Next slide. So in terms of where you can find more information about UK PACT in general as a program, and specifically on our project portfolio in South Africa, you can visit the UK PACT website. There's the link is on your screen, and there you can really read up on all the various projects we're supporting, including this one. And you'd also be able to get further information about UK PACT activities in the other countries I mentioned. You can also find further support on this specific project on the DNA Economics website. The link is also provided there. And I think from our perspective, in terms of the British High Commission, but also the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, we see this as an extremely important project, both in terms of advancing the climate-related financial disclosure discourse in South Africa, but also globally, heading to COP26, sustainable finance and financing for developing countries like South Africa, both from the public and private sources, will be a very topical issue. And so we see this project, as well as other projects we are supporting under the sustainable finance portfolio, as very key, and are areas we'd want to continue working with partners like DNA, as well as the other project partners involved in this project. We'd want to carry on working with them in this area going forward. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you once again for joining this webinar, and thank you to our project partners for organizing this and for all the work that's been done on the project. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Thapelo, and thank you for your introduction to the UK PACT project portfolio in South Africa. We're also, as a project team, very excited to hear that you look forward to working with us beyond the initial project scope of this project, and we certainly look forward to continued partnership in the years ahead. I'm now going to take just a few minutes to provide a bit more information about this specific South Africa-UK PACT funded project. And this is a project which is really seeking to address barriers to the analysis and reporting of climate-related financial risks and opportunities in line with the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Our project team comprises both South African and international project partners, which collectively have got very strong and deep understanding of ESG issues from a South African and an African perspective. And of course, in terms of our partners as well, strong international best practice experience when it comes to climate models and scenario analysis. Our objective for this project is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and timeous climate-related disclosures for investment decision-making by South African investors, such as retirement funds and asset managers. And so we intend to do this, or are seeking to do this, by supplementing and enhancing the impact of related initiatives focusing on TCFD currently in South Africa. The project's initial focus is on transition risk, and specifically the impacts of transition risk on listed equities. So South African listed companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and the resultant potential impacts on the asset management and retirement fund industry. In future phases of the project, we intend to expand this analysis to also include physical risks, as well as expanding the scope of financial institution to other financial institutions outside of asset managers and retirement funds, such as insurance companies, banks, and the like, and also to expand the coverage from the asset class of listed equities to additional asset classes like fixed income or unlisted equities, etc. And again, a key output is to also have South Africa-centric climate risk scenarios. And so as a prerequisite to further phases of the project, already in this first phase, we are starting to explore physical risk impacts as well as part of this current project scope. Again, as Thapelo mentioned, all of UK PACT's projects are a demand-led process, with the intention being to provide tools and support to stakeholders that are able to be easily used and widely adopted. So all of the outputs from this particular project will be open source, and you can already access a number of our project outputs via the DNA website link, which has been provided to you. Just to very briefly introduce our project partners, this project is led by DNA Economics. DNA Economics has got a climate change practice which has been advising South African government and private sector entities on climate change, climate policy, and has a wealth of experience in terms of advising on an economic and climate policy perspective. Along with DNA Economics, we have the Greenhouse, They're a sustainability consulting firm based in Cape Town, also with a wealth of experience in advising government and private sector clients in South Africa and the rest of Africa around climate risk and modeling of carbon footprints, etc. We also have Vivid Economics, and you'll be hearing from Rafael Chanskelsen during today's webinar. Vivid Economics is an international economic advisory firm with offices around the world, and Vivid Economics has been one of the leaders when it comes to modeling various climate scenarios and climate models. And we look forward to hearing from Rafael a little bit later during the webinar. WWF South Africa doesn't need too much of an introduction, and I'm sure that Wendy and Justin will speak to some of the projects and initiatives that WWF is supporting and leading presently, both in South Africa and internationally. WWF South Africa and 6 Capitals are together driving these capacity building webinars and workshops as part of this project. 6 Capitals Advisory is where I spend my time, and we're an ESG advisory business, also active in the financial education space. And our clients also predominantly include financial sector firms, such as investors or even listed entities wanting to progress their ESG performance journey. So this is a very high-level overview of our project partners. We encourage you to have a look at the project partner websites, and you can find more information also via the DNA website. In terms of engaging with the project team and with respect to the various deliverables underway for this project, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how stakeholders can engage with our project, the project team, and the project outputs. We have a steering committee for the project comprising Batseta, representing the retirement fund industry, ASISA, representing the asset management industry, as well as long-term insurers, and of course the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, representing issuers. We also have a broader advisory group where there are a number of South African financial sector stakeholders represented. Our steering committee and advisory groups meet every few months, and all of our kind of key project outputs and key focus areas of the project are assessed and reviewed and guided by the steering committee and the advisory group. So we do encourage you to engage with us in terms of our project, and we look forward to additional conversations either at one of these meetings or at our forthcoming virtual workshops, or you're also welcome to get in touch with a representative of the project team via email if you'd like more information. At a very high level, our project has got 4 kind of key focus areas. The first being capacity building and awareness raising. And this workshop or webinar series and the forthcoming September virtual workshops are key outputs as part of that capacity building and awareness leg of this project. And with that, maybe just to use the opportunity to highlight that we have 4 half-day virtual asset manager focused workshops, which start with the first one taking place on the 6th of September from 9:30 in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We have repeat half-day virtual workshops on the 7th of September, the 14th of September, and the 20th of September. And for those asset managers who are joining us for the webinar today, we'd love to host you at one of these forthcoming virtual workshops. In the reminder email that you would have received for today's webinar, the registration links are available in that email, and we'd love to host you for the virtual workshop sessions. Rafael will speak to this in more detail, but we also have on the 30th of September in the afternoon from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock. We also have a climate scenario workshop for asset managers. and we'd love for you to attend that as well. So we have a fairly full program for September for fund managers or asset managers, and please do register for one of those workshop options. If you're joining us today and you are a principal officer or a trustee of a retirement fund, we have 2 forthcoming full-day workshops which cater for trustees of retirement funds, principal officers of retirement funds, asset consultants who are advising retirement funds, as well as organized labor representatives. Those workshops will be taking place on the 9th of September. So the first of those workshops taking place next week, Thursday. And the second identical workshop, just on a different date, will be taking place on the 21st of September. And we'd really request that you consider attending those workshops, and we're sure that you will benefit from availing yourself for those workshops. Moving on, one of the other outputs from this project is an analysis and reporting toolkit, which is really looking from an SA-specific context, providing a toolkit that will be a resource both to South African financial firms, but also the issuer community. Part of the toolkit includes scenario development guidance, which Rafael will speak to later on in today's webinar, and also helping to, direct people to local sources of data and information, including data request and disclosure templates and checklists, which may prove useful to both companies and to investors. Lastly, our third stream is best practice examples, and this touches on the value of transition risk in a portfolio of 50 highly invested JSE listed companies. One of the outputs from this project, which you can already download via the DNA website, is 50 fact sheets which are looking at climate-related financial disclosures from 55 South African listed companies, and it's an assessment of what companies are currently disclosing against the TCFD framework, providing examples of TCFD compliant climate-related financial disclosures, and then also looking at what is practically possible in the South African context and what type of information asset owners such as retirement funds, asset managers and other stakeholders can expect to see as more and more South African entities start to report against the TCFD framework. Vivid Economics and DNA Economics have also contributed to 2 reports, climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa, and then one on more broadly from an international perspective. Both of these reports are also available for download via the DNA website. So we've also got an Atleha consumer financial education publication, which is really a broad-based introduction to climate-related financial disclosure. It's in plain, everyday language, and for those people that are brand new to climate disclosure, or would like to understand the impacts of climate on investment portfolios in a very straightforward and plain kind of language approach, we encourage folk to look at that publication and the series of short articles accompanying that publication. So I think that's enough in terms of introducing the project. Please do find more information via the project website. And let's then move into our content, which is why you've joined us today. And I'm going to be handing over to Wendy and to Justin. I'll still be controlling the slides. It seems that the slides are clearest when shared from my connection. But please, again, a reminder, while Wendy and Justin are presenting, please do ask your questions and we'll be sure to be monitoring the chat function. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Adrian. I've just turned my video on for a short while. I'll have to turn it off again. As Adrian mentions, I've got low bandwidth, so I'll turn it off. You can move to the next slide, Adrian. Thanks. So as Adrian said, I work for WWS Finance Practice and look forward to the session with you today. At WWF, we recognize that the financial sector is very important in shifting capital flows. And our work in South Africa with the financial sector, we've been encouraged to see what's already being done in terms of disclosure, and looking forward to hearing from you in the chat function where you are in your journey and sharing some examples. So I thought to start off with climate-related risk is just to give a little bit of context. So the session today is focused on metrics and targets, but it's important to understand that where does that fit in within the broader TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. Essentially, there are 4 key thematic areas from the recommendations from the Financial Stability Board. One is around governance, the second one around strategy, third on risk management, and the fourth on metrics and targets. So today, Justin and I are going to provide an introductory session on disclosure on metrics and targets. And I will share with you some key concepts, basic concepts around climate-related risks, and then move on to methods and tools. And before we move to the next slide, I'm just going to ask Safaka to share with us the first poll. Safaka, are you able to load the first polling question? Thank you. So before we move on, we just wanted to hear from you, which climate risks are you most familiar with? And let's wait to see the answers. As Adrian mentioned, the focus of this UK PACT is on transition risk, but we're very keen to hear what you and your organization are dealing with, or what you've read about the most, or what's most familiar to. So definitely I see we almost 90%, 87% is physical risk, and about 13% transition risk. The good news is that you've heard of either one of them, so there's no one that's not heard of physical or transition risk. Thanks, Afaku. So if we start off with physical risk, and I remember when I was first exposed to the science of climate change, or the sort of interface of climate change with the finance sector, there was a lot of concepts, a lot of acronyms that one has to get used to. So maybe for those of you that are just starting on this journey, it might seem a bit daunting, but let's start off with the physical risk. So physical risk is essentially risk related to extreme weather events, which might include floods, wildfires, or droughts. And what the risk means for the financial institution is that it can affect the company's physical operations, the supply chain, the transport, but most importantly, a material impact on your future cash flows due to either the changes in the frequency, so the number of the events, but also the severity of those extreme weather events. It could lead to potential change in the value of your investor's portfolio, but also with regards to insurance, you could be looking at higher premiums, and you could also be looking at clients that opt out to take coverage. The increasing frequency and severity of these events could also lead to physical damage of assets. We know that assets are important as collateral, particularly for banks, for residential and commercial property, and then also lead to increased credit risk and could lead to default. Next slide, please. The TCFD then guides us in terms of categorizing 2 types of physical risk. One is acute, which talks to a change in an event-driven hazard. So that would be the increased severity of a flood, drought, or fire. The second one is a chronic physical risk, which talks about a more longer term and slow shift in the climate pattern. That could be a change in your annual temperature or rainfall. Next slide, please. And when we talk about extreme events, it was good just to look at the different examples. Many of you may be familiar, the sectors that you have exposure to. These could be anything from a coastal flood, a cyclone, which was not in the South African context important, extreme precipitation, droughts, wildfires, flood, extreme heat, landslides, water scarcity, and stress. So you may be asking yourself the question, how do I know which extreme event would be of interest? It would depend on what sectors you have exposure to and where the location of those different companies. The data on the projections of the intensity and frequency of extreme events in South Africa, there's a wide range of sources. It could come from public data sources, which are free, also commercial service providers, which charge a fee for those data. Next slide, please, Adrian. So this is a good example of a financial impact of physical climate risk. So essentially what this graphic is showing you is an example of a physical or an extreme weather event, which is drought, but a specific drought index, which measures the drought intensity, the duration, onset, and end of a drought. And what's been done here is an overlay between the drought index of the drought physical hazard and the geolocation of power plants. So we all know that power plants need availability of water for cooling. So if there are going to be increased incidence of drought, that would severely impact the ability of the power plant to operate. And so this is just one example. Next slide, please. Another example is the recent, I'm sure many of you can still remember, the 2017-2018 drought in South Africa, which had quite a significant impact on the agricultural sector. Here we just have an example of the specific financial impact for the Western Cape province, which relies heavily on the sector for foreign exchange, but also employment. So there we can see the specific commodities from wine grapes, table grapes, pomme fruit to vegetables, as well as higher value like berries, figs, and pomegranates. We can see quite a significant shift in production, up to 20%, even 36.7% for grains. We know that grains is rain-fed, so it's expected for that to have had quite a negative impact. You can also see the actual value shift in value for which is quite significant again for grains, pomme fruit. And what's most important is the employment losses. We've recently seen the unemployment statistics for South Africa, and we know that we can't afford to be losing any more jobs. So we can see just from that one incidence of drought in the 2017-2018 production season, a real significant drop in employment in South African agricultural sector. Next slide, please. So as Adrian mentioned, the fact sheets that we put together, which we encourage you to go and read. If we looked at the banks that we reviewed, ASISA in 2020 put out their first TCFD report. And I thought it would be good for you to see an example of how they define physical risk. They use the same categorization as what's recommended from the TCFD. So acute risks is defined as arising from increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and chronic risks related to what I mentioned earlier, those incremental shifts in precipitation and temperature. When they describe the financial impact of these acute and chronic physical risks, you'll see that they provide a qualitative description at this stage, not quantitative. They specifically identify what they call climate sensitive sectors that are vulnerable to physical risk, citing the example of real estate and agriculture. They specifically mention the impact of reduced water availability affecting agriculture, mining, and hydropower generation. They also talk to the business interruption that could occur if their own operations were affected, the physical branch network, and also the data centers, and then also the short-term insurance, how they would be negatively affected by an increase in weather-related claims from their clients. Next slide, please, Adrian. So maybe I'm not seeing any discussion in the chat function, but it'll be interesting to know from those of you on the call whether in your financial institution you have quantified any past extreme events, what the financial impact has been for your institution. It would be good to have a better understanding of that. And whilst you share that with us, I'll move on to transition risk. So as Adrian mentioned, a big focus of this UK PACT work in South Africa is on transition risk. And as the name suggests, transition, we're referring to a shift to a low carbon economy. And those transition risks will arise from policy changes. In the South African example, we can all relate to the carbon tax. It can also be from a market transformation, so a shift in a particular industry to become Paris-aligned or to look at opportunities that arise. And those risks will have material impact on the future cash flows. They can also result in reduced income and value of assets, and also a liability risk if there would be people or businesses seeking compensation for the losses that they suffer, either from any of these examples. And the Global Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, did a really good study, which I'd encourage you to read, on what the cost of this transition will be for South Africa for the period 2013 to 2035 at more than $120 billion US. So really significant. Next slide, please. And so again, if we look at examples from existing TCFD reports on transition risk and how they define the transition risk, we'll see that both APSA and Nedbank, very similar, talk to the changes that would arise from policy, from the regulatory environment, technology as well, the market transformation or response. And interesting that both highlight the reputational considerations as well. If we look at the financial impact, APSA has quantified the impact of a carbon tax for them. At this stage, indicating that it will be negligible. They also do talk to the increased costs for their exposure in what they call high emission sectors, which includes energy, mining, quarrying, and manufacturing, and also the impact on asset values for their corporate and investment bank. Nedbank then talks about specific actions that they are planning. One is to have zero exposure to all fossil fuel related activities, which is included in their energy policy by 2045. They are also funding and will continue to fund the transition to renewable and embedded energy solutions. And then they provide quantitative estimates on the renewable energy actual exposure and also as a percentage of the total group exposure. Next slide, please. So if we then move away from that, I think, Adrian, have you skipped a slide? Yeah, so the last slide was just to highlight a very good UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme's Finance Initiative. They reviewed about 19 tools focused on physical and transition risk, and it's not exhaustive, but at least it provides you a good indication of what's available commercially. So we invite you to have a look at that. Thanks, Adrian. Next slide. So if we move away from the basic concepts of physical and transition risks and start looking at the methods and tools, this is just an introduction. As Adrian mentioned, there will be a focus on scenario analysis, and Rafael will share with us a little bit later about what they plan to cover in that workshop. But if we just look at the basics, so essentially there are two types of methods, stress testing and scenario analysis. Those of you that work in the financial sector will be familiar with both of them. So stress testing involves creating a hypothetical scenario for the future or in the future and running a simulation exercise to assess how resilient your portfolio is to that hypothetical scenario. It is forward-looking in nature, which is better suited for future climate risk. If we look at scenario analysis, we do know that the TCFD calls for the use of scenarios to assess resilience to climate-related risk, and hence the focus on scenario analysis. We know that this might be quite daunting and in many cases costly for financial institutions, requires quite a lot of work, and hence why the focus on capacity building in this UK PACT project and the workshop that will follow. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know this will be covered in the workshop. But essentially, a scenario provides you with an indication of a path of development towards a particular outcome and presents elements of a possible future. So what the possible future that you're looking to in terms of your Paris alignment. And again, if we look at an example here, which could probably be more relevant for the insurance sector, and also talked earlier to the availability of data for scenario analysis. In the South African context, we have our local CSIR that has mapped the impact of climate change on wildfires for the next 3 decades. So this is a data source that it's available publicly and for free. And essentially, it is a fire danger rating system, which provides you with an indication of the risk of a fire occurrence using quite time series data of a whole range of meteorological weather parameters, and provided for 3 baseline scenarios. So if you have exposure to a sector where fire risk is quite critical, or in the case of the insurance industry where you have a product linked to fire risk, this would be quite important for you to do. We know in the case of Santam, they've already made it mandatory for their clients in the agricultural sector that have fire risk insurance to be a member of the Fire Protection Agency, and also to be able to verify that, that they've done training with their staff, that they have invasive alien management plans and clearing those invasive aliens, because that is increased biomass and would reduce your fire risk. So that's just one example. Next slide, please. And then again, just ending off, if we look to existing banks, the APSA that have done the TCFD report, how have they approached scenario analysis? They have decided to implement a particular pilot with the agricultural sector. You might ask, why do they choose the agricultural sector? They have quite a significant market share in agriculture, and also the importance to our food security given the exposure to grains. So they partnered with the CSIR to do an assessment of the physical risk in the agricultural loan book, specifically looking at maize in the Free State province. And they mentioned the specific global climate change models that they use to measure the impact. In the actual TCFD report, there's not details on that yet, but they do mention that they're using these scenarios for the annual budgeting and capital stress testing. They've also conducted portfolio analysis of what they call the climate sensitive sectors, and they provide disclosure on the percentage of their loan book in each specific sector that will be impacted by climate risk. Next slide, please. Then if we look at Nedbank, also released their first TCFD report in 2020. They have partnered with the international nonprofit 2 Degrees using their PACT model and looked at alignment with a series of scenarios focused on the corporate and investment bank. And their selection of scenarios is those from the international agency. At this stage, they mentioned that they've just started this process, and the importance and the value of conducting the scenario analysis for them to assess their potential management actions. I think both these examples show that it can be either the disclosure can be quantitative or qualitative, and that many of our financial institutions are just starting on their journey. And so now I'll hand over to Justin, and thanks everyone for listening, and look forward to your questions and answers later on.
Thanks very much, Wendy, and good afternoon, everybody. Just going on from that a little bit and digging into some of the metrics and targets and different sort of key processes that are happening at the moment around climate-related risks and opportunities. So really going to speak just quite briefly about the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, which I think is pretty well known in the South African context. and then a little bit more on the science-based targets space as well. And I think really for us to understand that as much as, you know, disclosures are a kind of key imperative, we also need to be really sure that we are trying to align to what science is telling us from a climate perspective globally, and then making sure we put in sort of measurable targets that can be kind of properly progress checked as we go forward around those different areas across our different scopes of emissions. So Wendy, I don't know if you want to just add anything on the last bit on the disclosure metrics from an ABSA perspective.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I mean, I have covered some of this when we spoke about physical and transition risk. But I think what's important here is the kind of 4 main areas that's required for disclosure. And we see that ABSA has provided in scope 1, 2, and 3. What many banks and financial institutions still battle with is to provide disclosure on their performance related to specific geographical locations. Thanks, Justin.
Great, thanks, Wendy. So, I mean, fairly obviously, metrics do have a pretty critical role to play in all the activities undertaken from an investment, lending, and insurance decision-making perspective. And we know it's obviously a useful tool to be able to track the efforts that are happening to reduce climate change risk exposure. I think quite importantly, we've seen a lot of progress in the last couple of years from a financial institution and broader corporate perspective in terms of how climate issues have been integrated into key risk processes organizationally, and also responsibility assigned both at an executive level and also at a board and board committee level to really look at what the organization is doing around climate issues. So it's really key for those targets to be embedded in governance processes within the organization as well. I think one of the struggles we have seen is just the kind of consistent availability and reliability of data in terms of trying to set those targets going forward and then track progress. And I think more and more we are trying to encourage organizations that it's not a case of being sort of perfect or pretty close to perfect the first time around. This is really a learning journey for pretty much everybody involved. So at least taking a few steps in terms of disclosure, putting some commentary around where the gaps are and what you sort of see as challenges and where you want to go in the future is, I think, a really realistic way of trying to deal with what is quite a challenge to a lot of organizations. And then I think quite critically, again, the understanding between the direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions, and the fact that I think more and more the expectation for the majority of organizations is that they do need to have a good understanding of those scope 3 emissions and what the levers are to try and reduce those, whether they be across the supply chain of an organization or in other kind of indirect emissions categories as well. So digging into that a little bit more, scope 1 and 2, obviously the sort of more direct under control of the organization side. Scope 1 in particular around things like fuel usage, fleet vehicles, air conditioning, etc. Scope 2 has always been a really South African challenge because obviously the majority of our kind of energy source in South Africa is from a carbon perspective. So it's a really heavy emissions space that traditionally hasn't had a lot of opportunities to kind of escape those emissions for most organizations. As we sort of see the growth and changes around kind of renewable energy opportunities and the different processes around that, hopefully there is a little bit more flexibility and creativity happening as well. And then finally, from a scope 3 perspective, those indirect emissions are often a lot more complex in terms of making sure you've got reliable information. Some of them are a little easier in terms of things like procurement, wastewater, business travel, etc. But I think for some of our key sectors like food and bev, retail and others, those kind of supply chain emissions across scope 3 are often magnitudes of scale bigger than the direct emissions of an organization. So it's important to keep them in mind. So I think South Africa has been one of the kind of leading lights for almost 15 years in terms of CDP, particularly in the carbon space, and also increasing over the years around the kind of water and forests disclosure reporting as well. And I guess the big kind of influence point here is just the fact that there are a massive amount of kind of investor dollars really asking for this disclosure from companies and organizations. And more and more that's kind of leveraging progress and improved disclosure, and has done so for a significant number of years now. And that's resulted in close to 10,000 companies reporting through CDP on varieties of their sustainability kind of challenges and issues, as well as a really bigger number of cities as well. And that part's grown very, very substantially in quite a short period of time. So I think that sort of mix between the corporate and the kind of local and provincial government space is also important, because it does start kind of really breaking down those big global targets into sort of more manageable understanding of what cities and businesses need to do to help achieve the global targets. And obviously, besides the kind of investor push around this, there's some real benefits in terms of reporting to a quality level as well. First of all, protecting and improving the company's reputation and building that trust with various stakeholders, not just kind of investors and asset managers, but more broadly as well. Hopefully looking at some kind of competitive advantage in terms of performance, in terms of access to capital, in terms of positioning in tender processes as well. Very critically for many parts of the world is really trying to get ahead of the regulatory developments. And we've seen kind of mandatory reporting requirements happening in many different jurisdictions across the globe already. So as that sort of keeps progressing, the kind of pressure really does build in terms of reporting. And then obviously TCFD has now put another kind of recommendation level around that as well, in terms of really creating an expectation of organizations really aligning their reporting to TCFD recommendations. Hopefully, and I think many organizations will attest to the fact that going through these processes have really helped them uncover both what are the key risks for their organization and some of the mitigation steps around it, but also some interesting opportunities in terms of where they need to look at new market opportunities, who are new potential customers, and what are the shifts they need to make to respond to what's happening contextually around them. And then I think finally, really being able to sort of benchmark your performance against what's happening across the rest of your sector, across the rest of your kind of country disclosure kind of context again, and get feedback from CDP and from external parties around what's happening in terms of how they're perceiving your progress and your reporting as well. I think that line at the bottom was quite important though, and that disclosure is really the first step. It's all well and good to report, but obviously you need to be doing quite a lot to have something to report on. And I think that's where the sort of next stage in terms of targets and commitments really does come into effect. So jumping in then to science-based targets, and I think science-based targets have a really interesting and important role to play in a bigger conversation between business and government at a global level. So we obviously want companies to start making commitments both on the biodiversity and climate side, but also then really acting to implement ways to achieve those targets and looking at collaboration across sectors and more broadly to really take action. And then finally, I think also and importantly, the advocacy space, and one that I think South African companies have traditionally been a little bit kind of shy of getting involved in. But both recognizing good progress from governments and various kind of parastatal organizations, but then also I think putting a little bit of pressure on in terms of where we'd like to see key progress and key developments in terms of the governance space, in terms of national commitments as well. So science-based targets, or SBTI, is really an interesting collaboration between CDP, the UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, or WRI, and WWF. And that collaboration together with the We Mean Business Coalition is really trying to make sure that the Paris Agreement, the global kind of intergovernmental commitments and targets we've seen, are being pulled down and implemented at an organizational level as well. Really simply, I guess, that us as companies are aligning what we're doing with the best available science information as well. I think there is starting to be significant kind of understanding of those scientific links, and every time we see another IPCC report around just how critical and quickly we need to move, the more the sort of pressure ramps up to start aligning very clearly to what the timelines and targets are that we need to achieve a vastly improved kind of future for our planet as well. So Science-Based Targets Initiative is really trying to build technical foundations for helping companies in different sectors adopt particular targets that are realistic for their sectors, working to drive that adoption and get new companies on board all the time across key sectors and regions of the world, helping independently assess the targets as well, really try and create more momentum by celebrating the commitments that we're seeing coming through, and share some of the learnings and understandings of what's been required to set those targets. And then hopefully also making sure that this is a mainstream reality for many kind of key companies and sectors across the world as well. And this has been an interesting space for us in terms of South Africa's response, because I think, as I said earlier, South Africa has been a really fantastic kind of reporting and disclosure hub from a governance perspective and also from a CDP perspective. Yet we've seen very little progress and movement in terms of science-based targets in South African companies kind of putting their sort of stage in work here as well. So we really want to see corporate greenhouse gas emissions targets, reduction targets rather, that are consistent with the level of ambition that we need in terms of the Paris Agreement and the temperature goals we want to move within. So we obviously want that kind of mitigation goal for the global economy to, again, kind of be brought down to very specific sectors that really are key in terms of meeting those emissions reductions goals. And then making sure that we've got a clear time frame around that accountability space, as well as metrics that are relevant for the particular sector and for the individual organization that are actually setting those targets. So it's an interesting trajectory because, if you look at that graph, it's going to be quite different for different companies and not necessarily a very sort of smooth reduction space. But obviously what we are trying to get all organizations and basically kind of the entire global economy is to get to that net zero perspective over time as well. And I guess the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that South Africa and all the other countries have got to kind of update and put in from a commitment perspective is really the benchmark of what we're trying to achieve now from a corporate perspective, or from a city, academic institution, etc. space as well. Having those SBTIs in place for key companies as well. So very short sort of 5-step process. And there's quite a timeline that's kind of allowed across this process as well. Really starting with the commitment letter that your company is keen to commit, keen to set a science-based target. But that doesn't mean that you've got to start having clear knowledge of your target already when you are making the commitment. You can work on developing an emissions target, emissions reduction target, really, that's sort of appropriate to your sector and your particular business. And over time, look at how that sort of capacity is developed internally to set those targets going forward. And there's at the moment basically a 2-year time frame that's allowed in terms of moving from kind of commitment through to actually submitting your target and having it assessed by the SBTI partners for proper validation. Once it's been validated that you've actually set a target that does meet the kind of requirements of the Paris Agreement. So by that, I mean you've set a target that doesn't necessarily allow the world to end up at a 4-degree space rather than the 1.5 degree and below space. There's a validation that kind of checks and confirms on that. And then there's a communications phase as well that really helps to make those targets clear, hopefully again, build that understanding momentum of what's happening from a development perspective. And then there's an expectation beyond that we see that company-wide progress in reporting against the targets on an annual basis. So really a kind of 2-year and quite supported process as well in terms of working with the WWF, World Resource Institute, and other partners around setting those targets. So again, we hope that there's some really clear business benefits coming through that, making sure that there are those rigorous and credible sustainability commitments, hopefully helps in terms of improved sustainability performance into the future. Positioning in terms of your different key stakeholders that you would want to kind of engage with around climate issues as well. And then I think that kind of positive market signal and hopefully boosted investor confidence in terms of your organization being clearly aligned to key scientific evidence and you having a kind of pathway and trajectory to meeting those particular requirements as well.
Justin, I think there's an opportunity for a poll here. Does that work for you?
Perfect.
So the question is, which groups are more vulnerable to the effects of climate risks? Is it women and poorer households in particular, agricultural communities, coastal communities, or are we all equally vulnerable? Please take a moment to respond to that question. And if we can also ask you to let us have any questions in the chat function. I think as Justin comes up to the end of his presentation, we'd welcome the opportunity for Justin and Wendy to respond to any questions that you may have for them. So I see people are still voting, but it looks like for the most part, almost 60% are saying that we're all equally vulnerable to the effects of climate risks, followed by women and poorer households, and thereafter agricultural communities. I guess the good news for those who've got holiday homes is that for now, nobody is thinking their holiday homes are at risk. Back to you, Justin.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks everybody for the input there. I think that, it's an important question because it does also really highlight the context in which different economies are operating within. And for an emerging market like South Africa, we know that there's a lot of complexity in terms of kind of key sectors of our economy that are impacted, in terms of inequity and sort of social development and job creation context as well. So it's really key to look at that, as well as the fact that we've got particular sectors that will be really impacted by extreme weather events, by drought, like the agricultural space. Coastal communities, both in terms of things like sea level rise, in terms of impacts of storms, in terms of kind of the fishing industry's climate impacts are also quite majorly at risk. So a lot of nuance in terms of where these different risks do play out. So again, science-based targets are grounded in best available science, and there's a real context to try to operate within the limits of kind of our planetary capacity as well. At the same time, hopefully, being able to really look at the kind of measurable and time-bound nature of these targets does make it something that's kind of quite relatable and understandable for many of your internal and external kind of key stakeholders as well. It's obviously just part of the sort of overall roadmap in terms of dealing with climate impacts, and both on the risk and opportunity space. But we are seeing more and more of that kind of alignment between the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, TCFD, and science-based targets as well. And there's a sort of new overlay, which I'll touch on in a second, and really that kind of understanding and thematic that climate change and biodiversity loss are the two big environmental related challenges that we're facing from a planetary perspective. So we really need to look at these two issues together because of the interconnectedness that really exists there, and make sure that we're setting proper targets and proper kind of plans to deal with both of those as well. In terms of what we've seen from a progress perspective globally, you'll see there are kind of close to 1,700 companies that are part of SBTI at the moment, and quite a sort of mix at the moment between almost 50-50 really, with approved targets versus companies that are basically working on their target setting process at the moment, so really are in the committed phase. Big majority of those as well are starting to become the 1.5 degree kind of area. We really are transitioning away from the 2 degree commitments that they were initially made by some of the companies as well. And obviously that sort of real push towards net zero being a key kind of target point for the majority of companies signing up at the moment. So you'll see about 100 companies a month joining across the globe. And increasingly also starting to see more engagement from an SMME perspective in terms of looking at understanding around how that sector can respond and what the opportunities might be. At the same time as we've seen that really good progress around science-based targets, we are just starting to see the development on science-based targets for nature. And that's really the kind of biodiversity aspects that I mentioned briefly earlier. So the initial guidance was published just about a year ago now, and a lot of development happening around the methodologies through quite a broad coalition of organizations at the moment. But I think that the real hope here is that there's going to be really clear integration. That means it's not another kind of ask and another add-on over time, but that we really do start pushing everybody to think in a more integrated fashion around climate and biodiversity and how we manage and deal with those. So this is a little bit what I was alluding to earlier, the sort of reality in the South African context. And again, it's been quite a sort of surprising one for many of us that we haven't seen a kind of clearer response from South African corporates. So you'll see, 4 companies who have got approved targets in place at the moment. That's Woolworths, Hulamin, Sibanye-Stillwater, and Emira. And then a few that are currently in progress, ShopRite, Sappi, and GrowthPoint, who are working at their target setting methodologies at the moment. There's been quite a few other companies in the food and bev and retail sector who had put commitments in place but haven't been able to complete their target setting process. So they've fallen off for the moment, but hopefully are still looking at opportunities at the moment. So some interesting different sectors, but really kind of more your sort of heavy operations space. And hopefully we can start pushing more of a finance and insurance kind of engagement with these opportunities as well into the future. So as an organization that is potentially interested in SBTI, it's really a case of starting to look at what are the different kind of information sources. And there's a lot of kind of technical protocols that do look at the alignment from a greenhouse gas inventories perspective and with the greenhouse gas protocol accounting standards. But I think beyond that, really just to emphasize that the different project partners are there to also start helping and guiding organizations at a high level through the process and giving some support and feedback in terms of kind of steps and learning and different methodologies that are chosen. So as a start, obviously being clear on what the baseline carbon footprint is for the organization is pretty key. At the same time, it's also important to look at intensity measures so that there is a comparability that's kind of available across quite a number of different kind of metrics and processes as well. Hopefully going through that, it also helps starting to identify where the emissions hotspots are in the particular value chain of the organization, and where then you should be prioritizing your actions and your projects and kind of investment going forward. And then as you start sort of setting out this trajectory, also being kind of relatively clear, it's not always the most possible thing in the world, around what the kind of business growth is and how that kind of growth in your business is going to affect the ability to reduce your targets over time as well, and really use that sort of map jointly. So from a reporting company perspective, again, we know that the kind of scope 1 and to a degree scope 2 are a lot clearer. But just want to really make the point again that those indirect emissions can be such a massively material issue for many organizations. Some of the, again, food and bev and kind of retail companies have done this sort of quite detailed assessment through their supply chains and seen that those emissions are 5 or 10 times bigger than what's the kind of reality with their direct emissions. So it's really critical to be able to engage with your supply chain, hopefully encourage them to be reporting, to be setting targets of their own, and helping achieve your own emissions and the sort of global emission targets from that perspective as well. So there really is quite a key influence opportunity, particularly with big organizations who've got key partners, key service providers and suppliers who have quite a significant carbon impact of their own. So from a binary perspective, the expectation is at least the majority of about 100% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions should be covered, that you've got quite a strong medium to long-term time frame in terms of a 5 to 15-year kind of viewpoint into the future, at least from your target date. And ideally that there are long-term targets in place that are realistic to your sector and to your particular company's context. The kind of reporting space obviously requires annual greenhouse gas emissions inventories to be published. And then also, again, the scope 3 emissions where material, it's important to have an ambitious and measurable scope 3 target that does help you achieve the overall reductions that you need. As I mentioned very briefly earlier, that Paris Agreement kind of alignment has been pretty critical. But I think the more and more that we've sort of learned, even since Paris in 2015, that, you know, a 2-degree scenario or 2-degree future is not one that's going to help the sort of future of our planet particularly. So that 1.5-degree trajectory is really the critical kind of space. And in future, any targets above that are going to be phased out of the program in its entirety as well. And also looking at absolute versus intensity targets. So intensity targets are only eligible when they lead to absolute emission reductions. So really need to have a very clear connection between those as well. And then I think increasingly also looking at renewable energy opportunities and targets so that you can help achieve your reduction targets from that perspective. And hopefully with the developments in South Africa, even though it's been I think a bumpy ride over the last 5 or 6 years for many of the renewable energy sector organizations and the potential off-takers, there's a sort of clearer commitment at a government policy perspective, and hopefully a lot more opportunities to engage with that particular space as well for many companies. Thanks, Adrian. Cool. So at least a screening needs to be completed from a Scope 3 emissions perspective. And again, where there is a materiality to those Scope 3 emissions, if greater than 40% of the total scope of your 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And those can help or rather be looked at in terms of 2 options really at the bottom there, either emission reduction targets or supply engagement targets. So once again, the opportunity side of being able to influence a supply chain to really make shifts in terms of their own strategies and business models is a really big imperative here as well. So emission reduction targets, that first option, again, the sort of 5 to 15-year timeline, different thresholds also for the different target types. So absolute reduction targets can be one of the ways forward. Alternatively, an intensity target that is consistent with keeping temperatures within the Paris Agreement targets, as well as looking at other opportunities depending on what those Scope 3 emissions are that don't result in absolute emissions growth and do lead to kind of annual reductions within the physical intensity space as well. So a couple of quick examples in a few different sectors there. So Levi Strauss & Co., who've generally got quite a strong sustainability program in the apparel sector, have committed to reduce their absolute Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services by 40% within basically a 10-year time frame. Seiko, looking at Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services and use of sold products per unit of value, 44% reduction there in terms of a sort of 8 to 9 year time frame. And then Royal DSM, looking at committing to reduce Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, as well as upstream transport, distribution and waste by 28% per ton of product produced. So you'll see a couple of different metrics and a couple of different sort of alignments just within those 3 examples. One fairly absolute, one per unit of value, one per ton of product produced. And those are really to allow for the sort of differences in sectors and the difference in impact of the various industries that we do want critical movement around. So I think it would have been probably quite clear that there hasn't been a huge amount of kind of movement in the finance sector locally. And indeed, because of the complexities around the sort of investment lending space, there has been a very specific project that was launched in 2018 to really help the finance sector with its science-based targets kind of development for the commercial banks, asset managers and owners, and the kind of real estate investment trusts. Next slide, thanks, Adrian. And that's really trying to kind of develop the capacity of the sector to report across key issues. So there's been criteria documents developed, a set of tools to support the target setting process together with guidance, documentation, and then a number of key methods that are available for the finance sector to try and move towards setting these critical science-based targets. So there's been, I think, about 20 or 30 companies who are part of the kind of SBTI pilot process around the world, and starting to see more global companies now committing within the finance sector as well. And as we know, it's been really difficult to look at those kind of portfolio exposures and emissions. So hopefully the more and more we get these developments and this kind of critical momentum, the better it's going to be for the sector as a whole. Just quickly, second to last thing, as I said earlier, this kind of integration and really need to look at both biodiversity and climate has meant that the science-based target for nature space has really grown tremendously over the last year. Again, very closely aligned to the idea of trying to keep within Earth's limits and societal goals. And I think, with the context that we've managed to erode almost 2/3 of biodiversity on the planet in the last 50 years, there's a really critical kind of need to start preserving and restoring biodiversity, not only for the systems we get from nature, but also as one of our sort of critical barriers and resilience spaces to dealing with climate impacts. So the need for these two things to work really closely together going forward is going to be a key thing if we are going to get buy-in and support from the corporate sector in terms of setting targets as well. And then finally, the science-based targets net zero standard is being updated at the moment, and that's going to really hopefully come out just in time for COP26 in a couple of months' time, but really try and drive that setting of targets that do get us to a net zero perspective really quickly. Again, a set of pilot companies who've been quite involved in the development and the testing of this standard. But I think we are hearing a lot more around kind of net zero in the building context, in the discussion around kind of water and waste as well. So from a climate perspective, being able to set us SBTI targets that's aligned within that framework is going to be quite critical for us. So I think with that, I'll have a go at answering a few of the questions in the chat and hand over to Rafael as well in terms of the scenario detail.
Thanks, Justin. If you don't mind responding to between yourself and Wendy, we had a question from Christine saying, as a financial institution, how do you influence your clients to commit to the science-based targets? So some recommendations there around, if you're a financial sector stakeholder, how can you ensure that your clients do adopt the science-based targets initiative? Hubert asked a question around, to what extent can we say the trillions required to bridge the financing gap will be met? So more about where's the money going to come from to address this. And then Inga's just posted a question for you, Justin. Do you have an indication of the approximate costs to participate in the Science-Based Targets Initiative program? Justin, I'll let you and Wendy decide how you'd like to respond to those three questions.
Sure. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for the questions, everyone. I think just from a time perspective, I'm happy to just answer in the chat and send a few links and resources as well for additional information. And then Rafael can also carry on from the scenario perspective.
Thanks, Justin. So thanks very much for committing to answer to those questions in the chat function. Please, if you have other questions that you'd like to raise, either for Justin or Wendy, or for Rafael, our next speaker, please do place those in the chat function. With that, then, I'm going to invite Rafael Chanskelsen from Vivid Economics, our international partner to this project, to whet our appetite about the climate scenario workshop that's being scheduled for the 30th of September, and also just to briefly introduce climate scenarios. Rafael, I'll let you share your screen, so I'm going to stop sharing, and over to you, Rafael.
Thanks, Adrian. Sorry about that. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Rafael.
Great. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. And is everyone able to see my screen? All right. I'll take
yes.
I'll take that as a yes. Well, Let me start by introducing myself. So my name is Rafael Chanskelsen. I'm a senior economist at Vivid Economics, and I specialize in sustainable finance and Paris alignment for financial institutions. I wanted to give a brief overview of who we are at Vivid, just because I think some of you on the call may not know us or haven't worked with us before. So in essence, we are a leading strategic consultancy specializing in climate strategy. Now, that cuts across many industries, including energy and manufacturing, but we have a growing practice that specializes in the financial sector. And over the last 10 years, we've developed into an international leader in both climate-related reporting, so TCFD reporting and Paris alignment, and also the strategic side of decarbonization for financial institutions. And by that, I mean using levers to meet the Paris-aligned targets that the FI may have, and advising banks and asset managers on what steps they can take to meet those targets. And just a little bit about my involvement in that process. I led on a number of our pilot Paris alignment projects in the sector and have gradually developed a specialty for modeling Paris-aligned pathways based on climate scenarios and helping financial institutions to meet the targets that we help set for them. So that's my background. And I don't have many slides to present today. I just want to talk through very briefly what I'm going to show. I want to give a very, very brief overview into the rationale for having such a focus on climate scenarios in the UK PACT project. And I'm hoping to use the bulk of my time slot to elicit feedback on the draft agenda we have for the scenario training workshop. And I'd encourage all of you to please offer as much feedback as possible, because as Tapelo mentioned, this is fundamentally a demand-led process, and we want these workshops to be as useful to you. So please do offer feedback when we get to the agenda. Now just very, very briefly to give an overview of why climate scenarios are such a fundamental part of the UK PACT program. I guess the essence of that is that what climate scenarios do is provide forward-looking assessments of risks and opportunities that are related to the climate. And this analysis is fundamentally core to the TCFD recommendations. Now, most of you will be aware of the four main themes that are covered by TCFD. We've got them listed on the left-hand side over here. So there's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But the work we're doing specifically, for the most part, feeds into the last two of those, risk management and metrics and targets. And the idea of this program is to equip beneficiaries to, at the first stage, use off-the-shelf climate scenarios to meaningfully test their exposure to transition risk in the future, and use that information to set forward-looking targets. So those are the aims, and I think it's worth emphasizing that what we're hoping to achieve is to show that already off the shelf, using data from climate scenarios that is readily available, there is a lot that financial institutions can do to meaningfully disclose climate risk metrics that is neither especially sophisticated from a data point of view, nor does it require very sophisticated modeling or understanding of how these climate risks permeate into the wider economy. And I think I'm sure other consortium members will agree with me that what we're hoping to show is that because this process is voluntary, getting started in as much granularity as you see fit is a very meaningful process to start the journey of disclosing climate risk metrics. Now, just to give a little bit more detail in terms of what kind of data you can expect to get out of off-the-shelf scenarios. Essentially, the data that you get from these scenarios can help you model the effects of either transition risk or physical risk. And my colleagues from WWF have spoken about this at length, so I don't want to go into it in too much detail. But just to emphasize again that this phase of the project will be used primarily to test transition risk. And the hope is that in future phases, we can assist in the development of disclosure methodologies for physical risk as well. Now, before I get onto what we're hoping to cover in the workshop, we thought it might be useful to just go through some of some of the actual metrics that climate scenarios can give you. And on the left-hand side, we've listed some of the key variables that you can gather for free from off-the-shelf climate scenarios. And I won't go through each of these, but I think just to give you a flavor of how some of these may be used, off-the-shelf climate scenario providers such as NGFS and IEA will almost certainly give you a forward-looking assessment of a regional and global carbon price under different scenarios. So you can see that we have carbon pricing on the left of the slide. And that alone gives you a very basic proxy of forward-looking transition risk, in the sense that in the absence of mitigation action, emissions-intensive industries will become more risky and less profitable if carbon prices rise. And you can imagine that there are various other ways that the metrics on the left could be used for either measuring physical risk or transition risk. To touch on another one briefly, the forecasted energy mix, which most scenario providers give you, is another metric that could be used to test the exposure of energy-intensive industries to transition risk. If, as is the case in South Africa, a lot of heavy industry is heavily dependent on coal power, you can imagine that the transition risk profile of coal-fired power in an ambitious scenario will be very high in the near term. So this is just to give a flavor of how these outputs can be practically used in the stress testing exercise. And we'll go into this in a lot more detail in the workshops themselves. But what I want to do now is walk through what we're suggesting as a draft agenda for these workshops. And then I'm hoping very much that you'll be able to give us some feedback on this so we can tailor it more to your needs. Now, ignore the bio on the right-hand side of the slide. But just to kind of briefly summarize what we're hoping to achieve in these workshops, we thought that the first two sessions, the first two sections of the workshop could be structured, firstly, to give a very general overview into the basics of climate scenarios. So what they are, why they're used, and an introduction to key concepts associated with climate scenarios, such as physical and transition risks, and why they're relevant to FIs. And I think what's important to emphasize about this particular section is we're hoping to keep this as practical as possible. So this will include a much more comprehensive discussion on how the outputs from climate scenarios can actually be used. If you will, a much longer, more detailed version of what I just gave a minute ago. And then what we're hoping to do is talk through some of the considerations that inform the choice of scenario that a South African financial institution would ultimately use. So we'll talk through the selection process that we use for our representative portfolio of equities, and why we chose the scenarios that we did, which come from the NGFS Remind model. And through this process, we're hoping to put forward a non-exhaustive list of criteria that can be used to judge the most appropriate off-the-shelf scenario for your needs as an FI, before any kind of bespoke modeling is done to customize scenarios for the South African context. And then I think what is potentially the most valuable part of this workshop is talking through how to use the outputs to actually measure transition risk and to inform a disclosure related to the climate in a meaningful way. And what we're hoping to do is present a mooted three-tiered structure for disclosures using climate scenarios. And the first of these tiers will be the most basic. And this will use outputs from off-the-shelf climate scenarios, but involve minimal customization to the South African context and inform a largely qualitative disclosure. The second tier would involve targeted customization of some of the scenario outputs. And just as an example of what that might mean, for our representative basket of equities, we have modeled a trajectory for a South Africa specific carbon price, which off-the-shelf scenario providers generally won't give you at this stage. And what we're thinking for this tier is that through this targeted customization of scenario outputs, you can get at a more accurate assessment of how a South African portfolio would fare in terms of transition risk. But because this isn't an economy-wide model of climate risk, this would still at this stage be used to inform a largely qualitative disclosure, but with a stronger quantitative backing. And the third approach would be international best practice, which involves the use of some kind of economy-wide climate risk model. And this will feed into section 4, in which we'll present the results from modeling done by our sister company, Planetrix. And what this approach gives is the assignment of actual numbers in terms of value impairments at net present value to different sectors in this portfolio based on projected exposure to transition risk in the future. Now, the third approach is relatively data intensive and requires quite sophisticated modeling, whether you use our approach or develop your own internally. And I guess what we're hoping to show through this exercise is that there is a potential roadmap to the third approach that uses less data intensive inputs. And throughout the course of the workshop, we will propose a putative timeline to get to best practice, but start at less data intensive approaches. And just to emphasize one more time, the overall intention here is to show that with what's already out there and with relatively minimal heavy lifting in terms of data and modeling, there is a lot financial institutions in South Africa can do to disclose metrics related to transition risk in a very meaningful way. That is setting them on the path to alignment with international best practice in the space. So I realize I've gone through that all quite quickly, and that's because I'm very anxious to get feedback on whether this outline for the workshop on scenario analysis hits the mark in terms of what you would expect. And I think one final point to make before I stop for questions is in section 3 of this agenda, what we will also do is take participants through a practical worked example of how we might go about using approaches 1 and 2. So we're still ironing out precisely what form that worked example will take, but it may involve visually displaying a dummy portfolio or dummy exposures by sector and showing how you might use this to inform a transition risk analysis using off-the-shelf data from the NGFS or perhaps another scenario suite. So I think I'll pause there. I see there have been quite a few comments in the chat. I can't see them. I see one of them is from Adrian. I think most of these comments relate to Justin's previous session, but I wonder if it would be worth stopping here to take either hands or written questions in the chat, just to get a sense of whether this outline for the workshop hits most of the things you would expect, and if there's anything else that you feel could be refined to tailor this more to the South African context, that would also be very, very useful to hear.
Rafael, I think that's a great approach. I'm not sure if the hand function is active for today's webinar. So if anybody would like to make a verbal comment, if they can just let us know in the chat function, and then we should be able to unmute you. So we'd love to have comment and feedback on Rafael's questions and proposed content.
I think perhaps if there are no questions right now, we could also potentially circulate the outline to participants over email, just so they have time to digest it and offer feedback that way. But just to kind of re-emphasize, this process is fundamentally demand-led. So if you do have input on any of what I've just discussed, it would be very useful to hear.
Thanks, Rafael. I think we can certainly commit to sending your slides along with today's slide deck to all webinar attendees, and we'd encourage any feedback. Apparently, I've got confirmation that the raised hand function is working. So if anybody would like to make any comments, and direct any questions to Rafael, please do so. Now, as we do still have a few minutes available for Q&A. So we are monitoring the chat function. Please do ask your questions there. And then if I can just draw your attention to the post-webinar online survey link. It's a SurveyMonkey link. If we can ask you just to spend 5 minutes as we wrap up the webinar, providing us with your feedback. That's one of the requirements for UK PACT, our funder, to give feedback around how people have benefited from attending these sessions. I see there is a question here, which I think perhaps, Rafael, you best to respond to. And it's a question from Christine. I don't know if you can read it there. I'm happy to read it out if necessary.
No, I can see Christine's question. So yeah. Okay, sorry, I see that's the survey from Sipako. So just to respond briefly to Christine's question, in short, I think the assigning actual impacts in terms of numeric values, whether it's a value impairment or increased PD, is something that would come largely in the third approach. And for that, you'll need at the very least some kind of internal climate risk function, at best an economy-wide model of climate risk that assigns those impacts. But what we're hoping to show is that what the first two approaches do will not assign numerical values to PD or value impairments, but will enable you to disclose an overall risk profile meaningfully that is grounded in some kind of quantitative metric. That metric being the scenario forecasts themselves. And in the workshop itself, I'll talk through in much more detail how you can kind of map the scenario outputs to measurable impacts, such as the probability of default or value impairments. And we can certainly take this away as something to highlight in the workshop as something that will need clarity. And just one final remark in response to this. I think it's worth emphasizing again that because our analysis is transition risk focused rather than physical risk, what we'll be focusing on for the most part are policy responses and how those inform the risk profile. So Christine, while something like weather predictions has a very clear impact from a physical risk perspective, it will be limited, at least for our purposes, for transition risk purposes, unless there is policy action accompanying it. Apologies for the delay in response. I think I'm getting the chat messages 2 or 3 seconds after you send them. But just to kind of quickly respond to the last point, thank you very much for flagging that. That's very good for us to know. And we have been engaging with SARB throughout this exercise, and they're very much on board with this process. I think their stress testing scenarios, particularly on drought, will be very useful from a physical risk point of view. In particular, because a lot of the off-the-shelf scenarios wouldn't give you South Africa-specific granularity. So that's an excellent point. Thank you for flagging.
Rafael, it looks like they're letting us speakers off fairly easily today. I'm not seeing any further questions coming through, but as you said, let's also request feedback by email. And of course, the best place where we'd like to engage with those that are interested is at this particular climate scenario analysis workshop scheduled for the 30th of September. Are there any final kind of closing comments or remarks that you'd like to make, Rafael?
No, I think that covers everything. Just to, once you've had a chance to digest these anymore, please do send us feedback if you have. Otherwise, I'm very much looking forward to going through this in more detail with you during the workshop. And if any of you haven't sort of received a placeholder invitation, please do let us know, and we'd be glad to circulate that again.
Thanks so much, Rafael, for your presentation and just really flagging and inviting our attendees from today's webinar to consider joining us for that session, which will be taking place on the 30th of September. Also a reminder, please, for those of you that are available to join us, if you're a professional investor, you're very much invited to join us for our series of 4 virtual workshops, which will be half-day workshops catering predominantly to asset managers, taking place throughout September. Please do join us for one of those 4 workshop options, where we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail than we've been able to do in these foundational webinars. So please do register for one of those options of the 4 half-day virtual workshops. If you are a retirement fund trustee or principal officer, or you're a service provider advising a retirement fund, we'd encourage you to join us for our 2 options for the full-day retirement fund focused workshops, which will cover to a certain extent some of the same themes that will be at the half-day asset manager focused workshops, but there'll be a little bit more of an angle around how to monitor service providers from a climate risk perspective. Having had a look at the attendees from today's webinar, we know that a number of you are from the retirement fund industry. A reminder that each of these webinars has been accredited for 2 Batseta CPD hours. And if you'd like to claim those 2 hours and get a CPD certificate, please just email us your full names and ID number. You can email that to safaku@apros.coza. That's the email that we've shared in previous correspondence, and we'll gladly issue you with a 2 Batseta CPD certificate. Also a reminder, if we can ask you to please complete the post-webinar feedback form via that online survey link which you've received in the chat function. That is a requirement by our funders, South Africa-UK PACT, and we'd very much appreciate you just taking 5 minutes to complete that feedback form. We've run 4 webinars on these various climate disclosure related themes, with 2 webinar options for each theme. So today brings us to the 8th webinar in the series. We want to especially thank those of you who've been able to join each of the 4 themed webinars across the various dates. And a reminder that if you weren't able to join us for all of the 4 webinars, you are very welcome to visit our DNA Economics project website, and you're able to download and access the webinar recordings as well as the webinar slide decks from the previously scheduled webinars which took place earlier this month in August. With that, it's really just up to me to say a big thank you to our various presenters in today's webinar. Firstly, a big thank you to Tapelo Tladi from the British High Commission and UK PACT, who provided us with opening remarks and a little bit more information about UK PACT's work in South Africa and the various projects that it's supporting. Thanks to our colleagues from WWF South Africa, Wendy Engel and Justin Smith, for their presentations on the metrics and targets as it relates to climate disclosure. And then lastly, a big thank you to our colleague Rafael Chanskelsen from Vivid Economics, who provided a brief overview of climate scenarios and the program agenda for our forthcoming half-day workshop targeted for asset managers on climate scenarios and scenario analysis. We hope that you'll be able to join us again for these half-day virtual workshops for asset managers, as well as the full-day workshops for retirement fund trustees and principal officers. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to engaging with you as part of the project team during some of these other opportunities. With that, have a good rest of the day, and we look forward to connecting very soon. Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.